The day Cora Keller rode into Dust Creek, Nevada, in the spring of 1878, every soul on Main Street stopped what they were doing and stared, because a woman traveling alone with nothing but a saddlebag, a carpetbag strapped to the back of her mare, and a chin lifted so high it could catch rain was either the bravest thing they had ever seen or the most foolish. Cora was 24 years old, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of quiet determination in her face that made men nervous and women curious. She had come from Abilene, Kansas, where she had spent the last 3 years working as a seamstress in her aunt's shop, saving every coin she could, until she had enough to answer the advertisement she had clipped from the back of a territorial newspaper. The advertisement had been placed by a man named Gerald Fitch, who was looking for someone with a steady hand and a knowledge of fabrics to run the dry goods and tailoring section of his general store. It had said nothing about marriage, nothing about obligation, nothing but honest work for honest pay in a growing Nevada town. That was what had drawn her. She had not come looking for a husband. She had not come running from heartbreak, though there had been some of that too. She had come because she wanted something that belonged entirely to her, a life she had built with her own 2 hands in a place where nobody knew her name or her failures or the way her voice shook when she was frightened. She dismounted in front of the general store, tied her mare to the hitching post, and walked inside. Gerald Fitch turned out to be a thin, bespectacled man of about 50 with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers. He shook her hand without hesitation, called her Miss Keller in a tone that suggested he meant it as a real title and not an afterthought, and showed her around the store with genuine pride. The dry goods section was in disarray, bolts of fabric stacked haphazardly, thread tangled in a basket near the window, buttons mixed in with nails in a coffee tin that made Cora press her lips together to keep from wincing. There was clearly work to be done. Gerald offered her a room above the store, a small square space with a window that looked out over the rooftops toward the desert, and a salary of $9 a month plus a share of any tailoring commissions she could bring in. Cora accepted without bargaining, though she could have bargained. She was simply too relieved to be somewhere that felt, even slightly, like it could become hers. What Gerald had not told her in the advertisement was that Dust Creek had a town council made up of 4 men who had appointed themselves to their positions before the town was large enough to hold a proper election, and those 4 men ran nearly everything. The council met once a month in the largest room of the saloon, which was cleared of card tables for the occasion, and it was understood by most of the town's 312 residents that if you had a problem you wanted addressed, you spoke at the meeting. If you did not speak at the meeting, your problem stayed your problem. The council's leader was a man named Hector Prout. He was broad-shouldered, red-faced, and had made his money in cattle before pivoting to land deals in a way that had quietly made him the wealthiest man in the county. He dressed well, spoke loudly, and had a habit of agreeing with you so convincingly in private that you almost missed how thoroughly he disregarded you in public. Cora had been in Dust Creek exactly 8 days when she first encountered Hector Prout. He came into the general store on a Tuesday morning, looked at the dry goods section, which she had already begun organizing with neat labeled bins and properly folded bolts of fabric, and said, "Fitch finally got himself a girl to tidy up the back." Cora had set down the spool of blue thread she was holding, turned to face him fully, and said, "He hired a seamstress and dry goods manager. That would be me." Prout had looked at her with an expression she recognized immediately, the slow, measuring look of a man deciding whether to be charmed or offended. He had settled, for that first meeting, on charmed. He tipped his hat and left. But charm was not something Hector Prout carried with him consistently. Now, Clement Bishop had been in Dust Creek for going on 6 years. He had arrived at 22, sunburned and trail-worn from a cattle drive that had started in Texas and ended here when the herd's owner had decided to sell the cattle and dissolve the crew 200 miles short of where they were supposed to be going. Most of the other cowboys had drifted on. Clement had looked at the desert hills and the blue sky above them, and the way the morning light hit the scrub brush in a way that was almost beautiful if you stood still long enough, and he had decided, without much ceremony, to stay. He was 28 now, lean and broad-shouldered in the way that comes from real work rather than from wanting to appear strong. He had dark brown eyes and a jaw that was almost always shadowed with a few days of beard, not from carelessness, but from the simple fact that he was usually somewhere out on the range when he might have found a moment to shave. He ran 30 head of cattle on a small ranch 3 miles east of town, supplemented his income with breaking horses for neighboring ranchers, and had a reputation among the people who knew him as the most reliable man you could hire and the quietest man you were ever likely to share a meal with. The quiet was not shyness, exactly. People who had worked alongside Clement for any length of time understood that. He thought carefully before he spoke, and when he determined that nothing he had to say would improve a situation, he chose not to speak. He was perfectly comfortable with silence in a way that unsettled people who were not. He had attended every monthly town council meeting for 4 years without once opening his mouth during the public comment period. He sat in the back row, listened to everything, and went home. Nobody thought less of him for it. He was Clement Bishop. That was simply how he was. He first saw Cora Keller the day she arrived, because he had been at the hitching post across the street, adjusting a buckle on his saddle when she rode in. He had watched her dismount with the efficient, unsentimental movements of someone who had been riding long enough to have stopped thinking about it. He had watched her tie her mare with a proper knot, pick up her carpet bag, and walk into the general store without looking left or right at any of the people staring at her. He had thought briefly that it was a shame she was probably just passing through. He was mildly surprised 3 days later when he came into the general store for a new pair of work gloves and found her behind the reorganized dry goods counter, measuring out 10 yards of brown canvas for a rancher's wife who was talking at her about curtains with considerable enthusiasm. Cora listened, measured, cut, and folded with the calm efficiency of someone who was very good at what she did and did not need to announce it. Clement bought his gloves. He did not say anything beyond, "Thank you," when she handed him his change, and she gave him a nod that was businesslike but not cold. He left, put on one of the gloves to test the fit, and found himself thinking about the particular shade of her eyes, which were a dark, warm brown, the color of good river water in autumn. He told himself, as he did with most thoughts that arrived without invitation, to let it pass. It was more persistent than most thoughts. The weeks that followed were quiet ones for Dusk Creek, in the way that early summer in Nevada can be quiet, hot and still and buzzing with insects, the days long and slow. Cora settled into her work with a discipline that earned her Gerald Fitch's open approval and the gradual respect of the town's women, who came in first out of curiosity and stayed because she was good. She could let out a dress, take in a waistline, patch a quilt with seams so even they looked original. She charged fairly, and she delivered when she said she would. She took her supper most evenings at the small boarding house 2 doors down, where a widow named Martha Hale ran a table for the town's working residents. Martha was warm and voluble, and had the gift of making people feel at home without prying, and Cora was grateful for it. She was learning to navigate Dusk Creek's social geography, which, like the geography of most small western towns in 1878, had invisible borders that mattered enormously and were never written down anywhere. She had come to understand, through careful observation, that Hector Prout was the man who mattered most. And she had come to understand, through equally careful observation, that Hector Prout had decided he did not like her. She was not certain when it had shifted, or what precisely had shifted it. She suspected it was the afternoon she had politely declined his suggestion that she might want to consider renting a proper shop space rather than operating from inside Gerald Fitch's store, because the shop space he was suggesting happened to be one he owned, and the rent he named was more than her monthly salary. She had smiled, and said that she was very comfortable with the current arrangement, and she had seen something flicker behind his eyes that told her the suggestion had not been purely helpful. After that, the small difficulties began. Nothing dramatic, nothing she could point to in a court of law. Her deliveries of fabric from the Eastern suppliers started arriving late, and twice the wrong items were included, which meant delays and unhappy customers. She later learned that the freight contracts with the territorial supply company ran through a company Prout had a stake in. She could not prove the delays were intentional. She simply noted it and adjusted. Then one of her best customers, a rancher's wife named Ellen Garrity, stopped coming in. When Cora saw Ellen at the general store one morning and asked gently if everything was all right, Ellen looked uncomfortable and said that her husband had suggested she take her tailoring business to the woman over in Cedar Flat. Cedar Flat was 11 miles away. Cora understood perfectly. The whispers started around the same time. Small things, the kind of thing that is hard to challenge because the person saying it looks innocent and confused if you confront them. That Cora Keller kept strange hours, that she had left Abilene under unclear circumstances, that a woman living alone above a store was not quite respectable. None of it had any foundation. All of it was quietly damaging. Cora kept her chin up and her work immaculate, and she did not, under any circumstances, let anyone see her cry. She saved that for the window of her small room above the store, looking out at the desert at night where nobody could observe it. She heard about the monthly town council meeting from Gerald Fitch, who mentioned it the way you mention something important while trying to seem casual. He said that she might want to attend, that there was nothing official happening, but that it was good for business owners and community members to be seen. He did not say that Hector Prout would be there. He did not say that several of the things that had been happening to her had the shape of a campaign. He was a gentle man and he was trying to be helpful without frightening her. She went to the meeting. The saloon's back room smelled of sawdust and old tobacco smoke and was lit by 4 oil lamps hung from the ceiling beams. About 40 people were assembled on benches arranged in rows, facing a long table where the 4 council members sat. Hector Prout sat in the center chair, which was slightly larger than the others. Cora found a seat in the middle rows, between a family she recognized from the store and a woman she had not met yet, and she folded her hands in her lap and paid attention. Most of the meeting's business was the ordinary business of a growing western town in 1878. Water rights for a new irrigation ditch on the north side of town, a proposal to repair the schoolhouse roof before autumn, a dispute between 2 ranchers about a fence line that had been moved. The council discussed each item with varying levels of competence, and people from the assembled crowd occasionally offered comments or information. She noticed Clement Bishop sitting in the very last row, in the corner near the door. He sat with his hat in his lap and his arms resting on his knees, and he was paying attention in that particular quiet way he had, where you could not be certain he was listening until you saw his eyes move. She had served him in the store 3 times now. He never said much beyond what was necessary. He always thanked her. She had begun, she admitted to herself, to look for him when he came in. Hector Prout cleared his throat as the regular business concluded, and Cora felt the air in the room change very slightly, the way it changes before a storm when the pressure shifts. "I'd like to raise a matter of community standards," Prout said, in the particular voice he used when he wanted to sound reasonable, which was a slightly slower, more deliberate version of his regular voice. "As our town grows and attracts new residents, it's important that we maintain the character of Dust Creek as a family-oriented, respectable community." Several people nodded. Cora's hands tightened in her lap. "There's been some concern raised," Prout continued, looking at the middle distance in a way that made sure he was not quite meeting anyone's eyes, "about certain business practices and the character of certain newcomers. Not to name names, But when a single woman of unknown background sets up shop and begins conducting business in ways that have raised eyebrows among the town's established residents, the council has a responsibility to address that. The room was very quiet. Cora could feel the weight of people's attention without looking at any of them. "What specific concern are you raising?" asked Gerald Fitch from 2 rows behind Cora. His voice was tight. "The concern is general," Prout said smoothly. "The concern is about whether certain commercial arrangements are appropriate and whether certain individuals are in fact the sort of community member Dusk Creek needs to attract and retain." It was beautifully done, Cora had to admit, even as her face burned. It was specific enough to be about her and vague enough to be deniable. She thought about standing up. She thought about what she would say. She thought about every time in her life when she had spoken up and been dismissed, talked over, patted on the head and told she had misunderstood. She took a breath. She straightened her back. And then she heard a voice she had never heard at a town meeting before, because the entire town knew it had never spoken at one. "I'd like to say something." The voice was low and even, and the room turned toward it the way iron filings turn toward a magnet, because Clement Bishop was on his feet in the back corner of the room, hat in his hands, and in 6 years of attending these meetings, he had never stood up. The silence that followed was of the particular quality that happens when something unexpected occurs that changes, in some small, irreversible way, the temperature of a room. Prout looked at him. Looked at him the way you look at a card player who has just turned over a hand you did not know existed. "Bishop," he said after a moment. "All right." Clement looked at Prout directly. He was not angry in the loud sense of the word. There was no performance in what he was doing. He spoke the way he did everything, with the economy of someone who had thought carefully before committing to action. "Miss Keller has been in this town for 6 weeks, he said. In those 6 weeks, she has organized Fitch's dry goods section so that people can actually find what they need. She has completed every order placed with her on time or ahead of schedule, and she has conducted herself with more professional character than most of the businesses in this town have managed in years." He paused briefly. "The concern you're raising has no basis I've been able to observe. The delays in her supply deliveries trace back to the freight company you hold shares in. The customers who stopped coming to her stopped because word came from people connected to you that they should. I know this because I pay attention." The room was very still. Raising the question of her character in front of the entire town, without a single specific complaint or a single piece of evidence, is not a matter of community standards, Clement said. It's the use of a public meeting to do damage to a woman who has done nothing wrong. I'd ask you to either name a specific complaint with evidence behind it, or let this particular topic drop. He sat down. Cora realized after a moment that she was gripping the fabric of her skirt very hard and that her vision had gone slightly bright at the edges, the way it does when something happens that you were not prepared for. She made herself breathe. She made herself keep her face composed. Prout was very still. His face had gone an interesting color. 2 of the other council members were studying the table in front of them with considerable attention. "Those are serious allegations, Bishop," Prout said at last. "Yes," Clement agreed. "They are. I'll stand by all of them." There was a murmur in the room, not the murmur of displeasure, but the specific murmur of a community that has been holding its collective breath about something and has just been given permission to exhale. Gerald Fitch, behind Cora, made a sound that was almost a laugh, quickly suppressed. Prout looked around the room, seemed to calculate something, and then said, in his smoothest voice, that perhaps the matter could be revisited when there was more time to discuss it, and could they move on to the last agenda item about the road grading near the North Pastures. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. People filed out slowly. Several of them stopped to say something to Cora as they passed, small things, a nod here, a murmured "glad someone said it" there, a woman she barely knew pressing her hand briefly and then moving on. Gerald Fitch put his hand on her shoulder and said, "I should have done something sooner. I'm sorry I didn't," Cora said. "You're doing something now." That's what matters. She stood at the edge of the room while people filed past, waiting until the crowd had thinned enough that she would not have to force her way through. She was not ready yet to arrange her expression into something fully composed. She needed just one more minute. She felt rather than heard someone stop beside her. She looked up. Clement Bishop was standing there with his hat still in his hands, looking at her with those quiet dark eyes, and he said, "I hope that wasn't unwelcome." Cora considered him. She considered the fact that this man, who by all accounts had sat through 4 years of town meetings in silent observation, had stood up and laid himself out in public on her behalf without anyone asking him to. "It wasn't," she said. "Good," he said, and put his hat on. She watched him walk toward the door, and then she said, slightly louder than she intended, "Mr. Bishop." He stopped and looked back at her. "Why?" she said. It was the only question that mattered. He thought about it for a moment in the particular way he had, and then he said, "Because it needed saying and nobody else was going to say it." He walked out. Cora stood in the emptying room and thought that this was either the most straightforward thing she had ever heard, or the most complicated. She slept better that night than she had in weeks. The following morning, Clement Bishop came into the general store before Gerald Fitch had even turned the sign on the door to indicate it was open. Cora was already at her counter, organizing a new shipment of thread, and she heard the knock at the side door that led to the dry goods section and opened it without thinking, because she was already thinking about whether the shipment included the rose-colored silk she had ordered. It was Clement, hat in hand again in the morning light, and she was suddenly very aware that she had not yet put her hair up properly. "I'm sorry to come so early," he said. "I wanted to make sure you were all right before I headed out to the ranch." Cora felt something warm and flustered move through her chest. She pushed it to one side. "I am," she said. "Come in out of the sun." He stepped in, looked at the organized shelves with an expression that was close to approval, and said, "Prute won't let it go entirely. I want you to know that. He doesn't like to be contradicted in public, but he won't be able to keep doing it the same way now that it's been named out loud. You know him well, well enough. I've sold cattle to him twice. He pays a fair price, but he argues about everything to see what you'll give up. He's a man who thinks every interaction is a negotiation that he should win." Cora set down a spool of green thread. "He thinks I'm a problem he needs to manage." "He thinks you're a problem he underestimated," Clement said. "That's different. A man underestimates what he doesn't respect. He respects you now at least enough to want you managed." "That's progress in its way." Cora looked at him for a moment. "That is a very unusual way of looking at it." "I've had time to observe him," Clement said. 6 years' worth." There was a brief quiet between them that was not uncomfortable. "Would you like coffee?" Cora asked. "I was about to make some before the store opened." He looked mildly surprised, in the way someone looks surprised when they expected to leave and find themselves invited to stay. "If it's not too much trouble," he said. It was not too much trouble. They sat in the small back room behind the dry goods section, where Gerald Fitch had a pair of old chairs and a small iron stove that Cora had commandeered for her morning coffee. She made it strong, the way she had learned to on the road when the journey was long and the mornings were cold, and she handed him a cup and watched him take the first sip and look down at it with a kind of private appreciation. "Good," he said simply. "I'm glad," she said. They talked in that first real conversation about things that seemed small but turned out not to be. He told her about the ranch, about the 30 cattle and the 2 horses he was currently breaking for a rancher near the state line. She told him about Abilene, about her aunt's shop, about the 3 years of measuring and pinning and hemming that had given her enough skill and enough money to come here. He listened the way he did everything completely, without interrupting, without offering advice she hadn't asked for. It was refreshing in a way she had not expected to find refreshing. Gerald Fitch knocked on the back room door at 8:10, opened it, found them talking, and closed it again with a small smile that Cora chose not to acknowledge. Clement left at 8:30. He shook her hand at the door, which was an odd thing to do in some ways and the right thing in others, and she watched him walk to where his horse was tied, and mount in that easy way that men who have been on horseback their whole lives do, and then he was gone down the dusty street. She spent the rest of the morning organizing thread with a faint smile she was fairly sure nobody saw. The weeks that followed had a rhythm that she had not anticipated, and that pleased her more than she was ready to admit. Clement Bishop came into town twice a week, usually on Tuesdays and Fridays, which were the days his work brought him in for supplies or business. He stopped in at the dry goods counter every time, sometimes for something he needed, sometimes, as the weeks progressed, simply because he was there and so was she. Their conversations grew longer. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, that his father had been a farmer who went broke when Clement was 16, that he had left home at 17 to work cattle, and had been moving west in the gradual, unhurried way of a man following the pull of open country ever since. She told him about her parents, who had both died of fever when she was 19, within 3 months of each other, leaving her to her aunt's kindness and her own determination. He listened to this with a stillness that felt like recognition, not the recognition of shared loss exactly, but the recognition of someone who understands what it is to have had the ground shift under your feet and to have found your own footing again afterward. He had a dry, understated humor that revealed itself in small flickers, and she found herself working for it, constructing sentences that might draw it out, which was something she had not done with anyone in a long time. One Friday afternoon, 2 months after her arrival in Dusk Creek, Clement came in while she was trying to hang a new bolt of wool fabric on the high shelf behind the counter, standing on the short stool that was not quite tall enough, and she heard him come in but did not step down because she almost had it. "I can get that," he said. "I nearly have it," she said. He waited a moment while she struggled with the corner of the bolt which refused to cooperate. "May I?" he said. She stepped aside, and he stepped up onto the stool beside her, which put them very close together in the narrow space behind the counter, and reached up and settled the bolt neatly into its bracket. His arm was close to her shoulder. She was very aware of the warmth of his presence and the smell of horse and leather and something clean that was simply him. He stepped back down. She stepped back down. They were both perhaps slightly too careful about looking at the shelf and not at each other. "Thank you," she said. "The stool's too short," he said, by way of explanation for nothing in particular. "It is," she agreed. They looked at the shelf for another moment, and then they both, independently and simultaneously, seemed to find something amusing about the situation, and she smiled first and he smiled a half-second after, and it was the kind of smile that changed his face completely, opening it in a way that made her want to memorize it. "Are you doing anything Saturday afternoon?" he said, and then looked mildly as though he had surprised himself. "Saturday," she said. "No. Gerald closes early on Saturdays in summer." "There's a place," he said, "about a mile east of the edge of town, where the ridge comes down to a creek and there are cottonwood trees along it. It's cool in the afternoons. I thought if you'd like to get out of town for a few hours, I could show you where it is." Cora looked at him. He was not performing casualness. He was simply asking, with his quiet brown eyes and his hat in his hands, in the direct and honest way he had. "I would like that," she said. He nodded, said he would come by at 2, and left. She stood at the counter for several minutes after the door closed, feeling a warmth in her chest that she recognized and had been trying, with only partial success, to dismiss as gratitude or friendship or simple neighborliness. It was none of those things. It was considerably more complicated and considerably simpler than any of those things. Saturday arrived with the particular blazing clarity of a Nevada afternoon in July. Clement came at 2, as promised, with his horse, and a second horse borrowed from a neighboring rancher, a steady bay mare with kind eyes that Cora took to immediately. He had packed a saddlebag with bread, and a small tin of salted beef and 2 apples, and a canteen of water, which was the kind of practical, unsentimental generosity that she had come to associate with him. The creek was everything he had said it was. The cottonwood trees stood in a row along the bank, their leaves catching the light and turning it green and silver, and the water ran shallow and clear over smooth stones, and the shade was deep enough to feel cool even in July. They tied the horses to a low branch where the grass was good, and spread out a blanket Clement produced from his saddlebag, and sat down with the creek running 3 feet away. They talked and ate and were quiet and talked more. She told him things she had not told anyone in Dust Creek, about the particular loneliness of the road, about the fear she had had when she arrived that she had made a mistake she could not unmake. He told her about the first winter he had spent on the ranch, when the roof of his cabin had partially collapsed under an unexpected snowfall, and he had spent 3 days rebuilding it with frozen hands and the cheerful company of absolutely nobody. He made it funny in the retelling, though she could hear underneath the humor the reality of what 3 days alone in a cold, partially roofless cabin actually felt like. "Were you ever frightened?" she asked. "Here, I mean, in those first years." He thought about it. Not of the place, he said, of getting it wrong, building something that wouldn't hold. That was more frightening than any weather. She understood exactly what he meant. The sun was moving toward the hills when he said quietly, "I'm glad you stayed in Dust Creek." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the creek. "I wasn't sure for a while," she said honestly. "After the first few weeks, I wasn't sure it was worth the trouble Prout was planning to cause." "Is it?" he said. "Worth it?" She looked at the creek, at the cottonwood leaves moving in the light, at the desert stretching wide and open beyond. She thought about the small room above the store that was beginning to feel like hers. She thought about this man sitting beside her, who had stood up in a room full of people and said true things aloud because they needed to be said. "Yes," she said. "It's worth it." He looked at her then, and she looked back at him. And what passed between them in that moment was the particular and irreversible thing that happens when two people who have been careful and honest with each other realize that they have arrived, without meaning to, at something that cannot be unnamed. He reached over and covered her hand with his, gently, with the careful deliberateness of someone who wants to be sure the gesture is welcome, and she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. They sat that way until the sun was nearly at the ridge, and then they rode back to town in the long golden evening light, not talking much, not needing to. The courtship that followed was slow and earnest and completely in keeping with who they both were. It was built in the spaces that were available to them. Saturday afternoons at the creek when the weather was good, Tuesday and Friday mornings when he stopped in, and she made coffee in the back room, and Gerald Fitch made himself conspicuously absent. It was built in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't looking, and the way she listened to him talk about his cattle and the state of his fences, and the particulars of a horse that was giving him trouble, because she had discovered that she was genuinely interested in his life and wanted to understand it. He gave her small things. A piece of quartz he had found on the ridge that was the color of rose in one light and clear in another. A handful of early wildflowers from the meadow near his ranch. A book he had been carrying in his saddlebag for 3 years that he thought she might like better than he did. And she had read it and told him her thoughts on it in detail. And he had listened and occasionally disagreed, and they had argued about it good-naturedly for 2 Tuesdays running. He was, she realized over the long summer, unlike anyone she had encountered before. Not because he was larger than life or dramatic in the way that some men performed strength and confidence, but because he was entirely, consistently himself. He did not tell her what he thought she wanted to hear. He did not adjust his opinions to match her mood. He was honest with her in the way that you are honest with someone you respect, which meant that sometimes he said things she had to sit with for a while before she could agree with them. And sometimes she said things that made him go quiet and thoughtful and come back the next Tuesday with a considered response that proved he had been thinking about what she'd said for the full 5 days in between. She began to love him the way you love something that is also completely reliable, not because it is predictable, but because it is real. The love she had expected to feel someday had always seemed to her like something that would arrive with trumpets, with the overwhelming force of a river breaking its banks. What she felt for Clement Bishop was more like finding that a river was there, that it had always been there, and that you could depend on it absolutely, and that standing beside it was the most natural thing in the world. Hector Prout did not go quietly, of course. In August, 3 months after Cora's arrival, Prout's next move revealed itself. It was more direct than his first attempt, though still carefully constructed. He arranged for the owner of the building that Gerald Fitch leased his general store from to be approached about a substantial offer to buy the building. The building's owner, an elderly man named James Calhoun who had moved to San Francisco 2 years prior, was persuaded to accept. The purchase price was fair, because Prout was not foolish enough to make it look like a swindle. But once the building was Prout's, Gerald Fitch received a notice that his lease would not be renewed at the year's end, and that the building would be repurposed. Gerald told Cora on a Wednesday morning, sitting in the back room with 2 untouched cups of coffee going cold between them. He looked old and tired in a way she had not seen him look before, and she felt a fury on his behalf that was larger than the fury she felt on her own. "Can you fight it?" she asked. "The sale was legal," he said. "The lease is a lease. I have until December." Cora sat with this for a long moment. Then she said, "Then we find another building." He looked at her. "There are other buildings in this town," she said. "Or we build one. Or we find someone who owns property Prout doesn't control and we talk to them. He doesn't own every piece of land in Dusk Creek. He owns most of what's commercially viable on Main Street," Gerald said. "Then we find what he doesn't own," Cora said, "and we make it viable." Clement, when she told him that Friday, was quiet for a long time, long enough that she wondered what he was calculating. "My property line is 2 miles east," he said at last. "But I know someone whose land comes right to the edge of the eastern side of Main Street. Tucker Hale. He's got a large lot there he hasn't done anything with. He's been meaning to build on it for 3 years and never quite got around to it." "Would he sell?" "He might lease it," Clement said. "He's not someone Prout has leverage over. Tucker's from Montana originally. He doesn't owe anything to anyone here. I can talk to him if you'd like." Cora looked at him. "You would do that?" "It's not difficult," he said. In that particular way he had of making a significant thing sound like a small one. "Clement," she said, "it is not nothing." He looked at her steadily. "No," he agreed quietly, "it's not nothing." Tucker Hale turned out to be a rangy, amiable man of about 40, who had indeed been meaning to do something with his lot for 3 years, and was perfectly willing to lease it to Gerald Fitch at a reasonable rate, if someone was going to actually build something on it. Clement negotiated the terms with the straightforward efficiency that characterized everything he did, and Gerald Fitch looked over the agreement with careful eyes and signed it within the week. What followed was a remarkable thing, which was the town building itself, not through any official process, not through Hector Prout's channels, through the informal, powerful mechanism of neighbors deciding to do something useful. The men who came out on the first Saturday morning to help lay the foundation of Gerald Fitch's new store were men whose wives had praised Cora's work, men who had bought supplies from Gerald for years and were disinclined to lose that convenience, men who simply liked the idea of building something as opposed to watching someone be pushed out. Clement organized it quietly and without fanfare, which meant that by the time anyone might have thought to interfere, there were already 20 men working and a foundation half laid. Martha Hale from the boarding house appeared at noon with enough food for all of them, and the wives of several of the men came in the afternoon and brought more, and the whole thing took on the quality of a community project in a way that Dusk Creek had perhaps not experienced since the original settlers had arrived and built the first structures together out of simple necessity. Cora worked alongside them, carrying, measuring, making herself useful in the ways she could, and more than once she caught Clement's eye across the work site, and the look that passed between them in those moments was something she tucked away carefully, like a piece of fine fabric saved for the right purpose. Pruitt showed up on the second Saturday, walking the perimeter of the building site with his hands clasped behind his back and his face arranged in the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head. He watched for a while without saying anything, which in its way said everything. He approached Cora as she was carrying a length of timber, which he waited for her to set down before he spoke. "Industrious," he said. "Thank you," she said. "I want you to know," he said in a lower voice, "that I have nothing personal against you." Cora looked at him with complete directness. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "I don't believe that for a moment, but it doesn't particularly matter. The building is being built on land you don't own, with labor from people who have chosen to help freely, and the lease is signed. So whatever you have or don't have against me personally, it won't change what's happening here." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You're stubborn." "I am persistent," she said with precision. "It's different." He made a sound that might, in a different man, have been a laugh. He walked away. He did not interfere with the building again. The new store was completed in 6 weeks, which was remarkable by any standard. It was a square, solid, well-built structure with real glass in the front windows and a proper counter and shelving that Clement and 3 other men had constructed from good timber. The dry goods section was larger than the one in the old store, with room for Cora to have a proper tailoring space in the back with adequate light from a side window. Gerald Fitch cried the day they moved in, quietly and without any attempt to hide it, and then laughed at himself, and Cora hugged him, which surprised them both. On the day the new store opened for business, Clement came in as the first customer. He bought a pair of work gloves, which were not in fact something he needed, because she had sold him a pair 2 weeks ago and he had not worn them out. She did not say this. She wrapped them in brown paper and tied it with string and handed them over, and he paid, and then he said, "It looks good." She looked around at the neat shelves and the bolted fabric and the warm wood of the new counter. "It does," she said, with a satisfaction that was bone deep. "You should be proud," he said. "We should be proud," she corrected. He held her gaze for a moment and then he said quietly, "I need to ask you something." She looked at him. Outside, the town was going about its morning business, and Gerald Fitch was somewhere in the back room making himself available to be needed in a particular direction if needed. "All right," she said. He put the wrapped gloves down on the counter. He did not fidget, did not shift his weight. He was Clement Bishop, and even in this he was himself. "I'd like to court you properly," he said. "I know we've been spending time together, and I know you're capable of making your own decisions about what that is and what it means. But I'd like to be clear about what it means for me. I'd like to court you, with the intention of asking you to marry me, if you're willing." Cora heard the precision of his words and loved them for it. He was not assuming. He was not performing. He was telling her exactly where he stood and leaving the ground entirely clear for her to stand wherever she chose. "You're asking if I'm willing to be courted," she said slowly. "With honesty about where I hope it goes," he said. "Yes." She thought about the creek and the cottonwood trees. She thought about the way he had stood up in the saloon meeting room and said true things in a steady voice. She thought about his hands in the firelight of the work site and the way he had said, "You should be proud," just now, looking at something she had helped build and meant it. "Yes," she said. "I'm willing." The autumn that followed was the most extraordinary season of Cora Keller's life, and she had had several that were extraordinary in less pleasant ways, so the comparison had weight. Clement courted her with the same honest, careful attention he brought to everything. He came to the store on his town days. He rode out with her on Saturday afternoons when the weather allowed, showing her the desert in a way she had not yet learned to see it, pointing out a hawk wheeling high on a thermal, explaining which plants could tell you where water was close by, talking about the land with a love that was understated and absolute. She cooked supper for him twice at the boarding house's kitchen, with Martha Hale's cheerful permission, and they ate together at the small table by the window. And on the second occasion, he helped her wash up afterward, which was not a thing that would have seemed significant to anyone who had not spent enough time with Clement Bishop to understand that when he chose to do something, it was because he wanted to. The town had largely settled into a kind of acceptance of Cora's presence that verged on warmth. The new store's success had helped. The building of it had helped more. Hector Prout had retreated into a sullen, dignified distance, which was the most everyone could realistically hope for. He still ran the town council. He still had more money and influence than most. But Cora had demonstrated, in the most practical possible way, that she was not easily moved, and some of the people who had quietly avoided her were now quietly on her side, which in a town of 312 people added up to something significant. Ellen Garrity came back in October, looking slightly mortified, and said that she needed a new winter coat let out at the seams, and that she was sorry she had been away so long. Cora did the alterations and charged the standard price, and said nothing at all about the months of absence, and Ellen Garrity went out looking relieved and brought in 2 of her friends the following week. On a clear October evening when the air had the particular sharpness of early autumn and the stars were very bright, Clement took Cora up on the ridge east of town, where the view of the valley was unobstructed, and you could see the lights of Dust Creek below, small and golden, and scattered against the dark ground. He had brought a blanket and she had brought a tin of molasses cookies she had made the day before, and they sat on the blanket with the cookies between them and the vast dark sky above. He asked her, as the evening deepened, about what she wanted. Not about him, not about the store, but in the larger sense. What she wanted from the life she was building. She thought about it honestly. "I want what I have," she said, "which is more than I expected to want, so I'm still adjusting to it. A place that's mine. Work that's meaningful. People who are real." She paused. "I think I used to want security in the way you want something you've never had. I thought security was something external. Something you got given, but it's not." "No," he said. "You built yours," she said. "I'm still building it," he said. She looked at him in the starlight. He was looking at her in the same way, with those quiet dark eyes that missed nothing and asked nothing he hadn't earned the right to ask. "I love you," she said, and felt the words settle in the air between them with the weight of something true. She had not planned to say it first. She did not regret it. He was very still for a moment. Not the stillness of surprise or calculation, but the stillness of someone receiving something carefully. "I love you," he said, and it sounded like something he had known for a while and was relieved to be allowed to say. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat on the ridge with the town below them and the sky above, and she felt, with a certainty she had not expected to ever feel about anything, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He proposed in November, not on the ridge and not at the creek, but in the dry goods section of the new store on a Tuesday morning, with Gerald Fitch making absolutely no pretense of going anywhere else, and Martha Hale, who had somehow known to be there, standing in the doorway with her hand pressed over her mouth. He went down on one knee on the wooden floor between the fabric bolts and the button bins, and he held out a ring he had made by the silversmith in Cedar Flat, a simple band with a small turquoise stone the color of the Nevada sky, and he said, "I'd like to marry you, Cora Keller, if you'll have me. I promise you honesty and partnership, and that I'll always say what I mean and mean what I say." Cora looked down at him and at the ring and at his face, which was open and sincere and a little terrified in the particular way of a man who is very sure what he wants but knows that he cannot control what the answer will be. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He laughed, which was a thing she had rarely heard him do, and loved immediately, and stood up and put the ring on her finger, and Gerald Fitch said something congratulatory that was slightly muffled by his own emotion, and Martha Hale abandoned any pretense of distance and embraced them both. They were married in December, in the church Dust Creek had built the previous year, in a ceremony that was simple and attended by most of the town. Gerald Fitch stood in as something like a father. Martha Hale cried openly and without apology. Hector Prout was not present, which was exactly right. The dress Cora wore she had made herself, from a bolt of ivory wool that she had been saving since September without consciously knowing what she was saving it for, and it had a fitted bodice and a simple skirt and no unnecessary decoration, because she was not a woman who required unnecessary decoration. She wore her hair up, with a small spray of dried winter wildflowers that Clement had brought her the week before without explanation, and she understood when she put them in her hair that he had been counting on her to figure out what they were for. He wore a dark coat she had not seen before, which fit him properly, which meant he had either had it made or had owned it for so long that he had worn it in. When she asked him after, he said he had bought it in Cedar Flat 2 weeks ago, and she smiled at the image of this man, who never purchased anything he did not need, going to Cedar Flat to buy a coat for his wedding with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything. The ceremony was short and honest. The words they said to each other were the ones the minister offered, but they each said them with a directness that made the familiar phrases feel newly specific, as though they were the first people to mean them this precisely. When it was done and they were outside in the cold December air, she took his arm and they walked through the small crowd of well-wishers, and she felt, moving through the clear winter light with his warmth beside her, that she had made every right choice and had been brave enough to stay through the ones that had been difficult, and that the town around her was neither entirely safe nor entirely kind, but was hers in the way that a thing can be yours when you have fought for it and built it and chosen to remain. The celebration that evening was held in the saloon, which had been transformed for the occasion with more enthusiasm than elegance, and the town's fiddle player and his friend who played harmonica provided music that was spirited enough to compensate for what it lacked in technical refinement. People danced, which Cora did not know Clement did, and was startled and delighted to discover that he danced with the same quiet competence he brought to everything physical. He was not showy about it. He simply knew where to put his feet and how to lead, and when they danced together in the cleared space in the center of the room, she followed him as naturally as if they had been practicing. "You dance," she said as they turned. "I do some things that might surprise you," he said with that small, transforming smile. "I'm counting on it," she said. He moved her to live at the ranch, which she had been to twice and loved with a wholehearted appreciation for its simplicity and the quality of its light at different times of day. The cabin was small but solid, and she brought with her organization and color and the particular warmth of someone who knows how to make a space feel inhabited. She hung curtains she made from a leftover bolt of good blue cotton, and she made a quilt for the bed from scraps of fabric she had been collecting since she arrived, a record in textile of her time in Dust Creek. She kept her tailoring work going at the store, riding in on the town days with Clement, which was its own pleasure, the morning ride in the cool air with the light coming over the desert hills and the town appearing below them like something laid out for their arrival. She and Gerald Fitch worked out a new arrangement where she kept her tailoring clientele and a fair commission from dry goods sales, and Gerald hired a young man named Pete Alderman to help with the lifting and stacking, which freed Cora to focus on the work she was actually good at. Pete turned out to be energetic and slightly chaotic and good-hearted in equal measure, and Cora managed him with the calm firmness of someone who had dealt with worse and found it amusing rather than frustrating. The spring of 1879 arrived with the particular sudden beauty of the Nevada desert in bloom, when the wildflowers appeared in the scrub almost overnight, and the air smelled green and clean after the winter's dryness. Cora discovered in March that she was pregnant, which she determined with a certainty that preceded any visible sign by several weeks, simply from the quality of her own body's signals that she had learned to trust. She told Clement on a Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, in the direct way that seemed the only possible approach with him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was not less composed than his usual expression, but was deeper, more unguarded, full of something large. "Good," he said softly. "That's good." She squeezed his hands. "You're not frightened. "I'm terrified," he said honestly. "And it's good." She laughed and he smiled, and outside the desert evening was going quietly about its business. Their son was born in November of 1879, which seemed to Cora like the right time, because November was when the light in the desert had a particular quality that she had come to love above all the other lights the year offered. He was born healthy and loud and with Clement's dark eyes, and they named him Samuel after Clement's grandfather in Missouri, who had been, according to Clement, the best and most honest man he had personally encountered in his life. Samuel Bishop arrived in the world at 4 in the morning with Martha Hale and the town's doctor in attendance, and Clement was there the whole time, which the doctor suggested was irregular, and which neither Cora nor Clement paid any attention to. He held her hand and said very little and was exactly where she needed him to be, which she had come, over the course of a year of marriage, to understand was the specific and consistent gift he offered. When Samuel was placed in his arms for the first time, Clement stood very still and looked at his son's face with the complete, absorbed attention of a man memorizing something he does not want to forget. He said nothing for a long time. When he spoke, it was to the baby, in a low voice that Cora could barely hear, and she did not ask later what he had said. Some things are right to be private. The years that followed were the years she had come to Dusk Creek to build, and they exceeded what she had imagined in the specific ways that reality exceeds imagination when imagination is limited by what you have not yet experienced. Dusk Creek grew. By 1882, it had 500 residents and a proper elected town council, which Hector Prout attempted to remain on, and managed for one term before losing a re-election bid to a younger man named George Farrell, who had the novel quality of being actually interested in what was good for the town rather than what was good for himself. Prout remained wealthy and present and significantly less powerful, and eventually seemed to reach a form of accommodation with his diminished influence that was not exactly gracious, but was functional. Gerald Fitch, now in his late 50s, began talking about retirement in the spring of 1882, and in a conversation that lasted 3 days and covered many cups of coffee, he and Cora worked out an arrangement by which she would buy the store from him in installments from her profits, with the first installment due when she and Clement felt comfortable with it. It was a generous arrangement that Gerald presented as simply practical, and that Cora received with gratitude she expressed not in words, but in continuing to run the store with the same meticulous care she had brought to it from the first week. By the time Samuel Bishop was 3 years old, he was already following his father around the ranch with the intensity of a child who has decided what he wants to be and cannot see why he has to wait. He was a serious, attentive boy with Clement's quality of observation and Cora's directness, and the combination was occasionally startling in someone so small. He called his father Pa and his mother Mama with equal emphasis and would brook no differentiation in the standard of attention he received from either of them. Cora loved motherhood in a way she had not fully anticipated, not because she had expected not to love it, but because she had not known quite what shape the love would take. It was harder than anything else she had done and more fundamental than anything else, and it coexisted with the work she loved and the life she had built in a way that did not require her to diminish either one to accommodate the other. Clement was a father in the same way he was a husband and a rancher, with complete and consistent presence. He did not treat fatherhood as an occasional contribution. He was there, specifically and reliably, and Samuel grew knowing that the world was a trustworthy place, because the two people at the center of his world said what they meant and did what they said. In the summer of 1883, Cora discovered she was pregnant again, which she received with slightly more equanimity than the first time, having now the evidence of once before that she was capable of it. She told Clement the same way, at the same table, on a Tuesday evening, and his response was the same quietness and the same taking of her hands and the same honest admission of being terrified, alongside the same genuine gladness. Their second child was a boy they named Eli, born in February of 1884, rounder and louder than Samuel had been and with Cora's coloring, and an expression, even in infancy, of cheerful determination that made people laugh. Samuel received his brother with the seriousness of a child confronted with something he had requested, and now had to figure out what to do with, and then settled, within about 2 weeks, into a proprietary affection that expressed itself in telling Eli what everything was called, and explaining the ranch to him in great detail despite Eli's evident inability to follow any of it. The store became Cora's in full by the summer of 1885. The last installment paid on a warm June afternoon, with Gerald Fitch watching and smiling in the particular way of a man who has handed something he loves to someone he trusts. She had expanded it by that point, adding a second window for more light in the tailoring section and a proper counter for fabric bolts that she had designed herself and had built by a local carpenter who had gotten her exact specifications and executed them precisely. She was known, by 1885, as the best seamstress in the county and possibly in the territory. She had more work than she could comfortably take, and had recently taken on a young woman named Anna Reyes as an apprentice, who had quick hands and a good eye, and who Cora was teaching with the same patience and precision that her aunt had once used with her. Hector Prout came into the store in the autumn of 1885 to commission a suit of clothes for his nephew's wedding, which required Cora to take his measurements and produce something that fit well. She did both with complete professionalism. He paid her promptly and said that the work was excellent, and she thanked him with the same tone she used for every customer, and that was the end of it. Not friendship, not warmth, but a working civility that was perhaps the most the situation could produce and was sufficient. On the anniversary of their wedding, in December of 1885, 7 years from the day she had ridden into Dust Creek with her chin up in her carpetbag, Clement saddled 2 horses and told her he had something to show her. Samuel was old enough to stay at the ranch with old Pete Alderman, who had become a family fixture over the years, and Eli was with him, and they rode out in the clear December air. He took her to the ridge, which was still her favorite place in the world. The valley spread below them in the winter light, and Dust Creek was visible in the middle distance, larger now, with the new buildings and the church spire and the school that had been rebuilt twice since the first one. She could see the roof of their store from here. She could see, further east, the spread of their ranch. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he agreed. She leaned against him, which she could do now with the ease of long practice and long trust, and he put his arm around her in the natural, unself-conscious way of a man who has learned where someone fits in the world relative to himself. "Are you happy?" she asked him. She asked him this periodically, not from insecurity but from genuine interest, because he was not a man who volunteered the information unprompted, and she wanted to know. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was being honest rather than quick. "Yes," he said, "more than I expected to be." "I didn't expect to be happy here," she said. "I expected to be stable. I thought stable was what I wanted. And now?" She looked at the valley, at the store's roof, at the spread of land that was theirs in the legally recorded and personally fundamental sense. She thought of Samuel explaining the horses to his little brother in his serious voice. She thought of Clement's hands, work-roughened and gentle, and the ring on her finger which she had not removed in 7 years except to clean it. "Now I know better," she said. He turned his head and pressed his lips to her hair briefly in the way he had. "I stood up at that meeting," he said quietly, "because someone needed to say the truth and I had it available." "I know," she said, "but it was also because of you specifically," he said. "Because you had come here with everything you had, and you were refusing to be moved by people who had no right to try, and I thought that deserved someone who was willing to stand beside it." She was quiet for a moment, holding this. "You've been standing beside it ever since," she said. "Yes," he said simply. "I have." She turned and looked at him, this man who never spoke at town meetings until the day it mattered, this quiet, steady man who had seen her clearly from the first and had never in 7 years looked at her as anything other than someone worth standing beside. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she had the first time on this ridge, with the same settled certainty. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he always said it, directly, without performance, as a statement of fact about the most important matter he knew. Below them, Dusk Creek went about its evening, lights beginning to show in the windows, smoke rising from chimneys in the cold air. 312 people becoming 600 in the way of growing towns in the American West, where everything moved and changed and settled and moved again. But this ridge, and this view, and this man beside her with his arm around her in the December dusk, these were as fixed and reliable as any coordinate on a map. She had found her direction by them, and she intended to keep them as long as the world allowed. They rode home in the gathering dark, and the lights of the ranch came up warm and steady through the trees as they came down the ridge, and from inside she could hear Samuel's voice, explaining something with great seriousness to Eli, who was probably not listening, and Pete Alderman's low laugh at whatever Samuel had said. She dismounted, and Clement took her horse, and she walked toward the warm lit window, and before she went in she paused and looked back at him, at the shape of him in the dusk against the desert, still and sure as the ridge itself. He looked back at her, and the smile that crossed his face in that moment was the same one she had first seen in the cramped space behind the dry goods counter, opening his face like light through a curtain, and she thought, as she had thought many times, that it was the best thing she had ever found. She went inside. He followed. Samuel launched himself at her the moment the door was open, full of something important about what the horses had done today, and Eli raised both arms from his spot on the rug, where he was destroying a corn-husk doll with cheerful thoroughness, and she gathered them both, and the cabin filled with the noise of children and warmth, and Clement came in and closed the door against the cold, and the ranch closed around them all like something both held and holding. In the spring of 1887, when Eli was 3 and Samuel was 7, and the store was thriving, and the ranch had grown to 60 head of cattle, and Clement had 3 horses under regular training contract from neighboring ranches, Cora discovered for the third and final time that a new person was coming. This time she told him at breakfast, before he went out for the morning's work, handing him his coffee and saying simply, "I believe there will be another one by autumn." He held his coffee cup and looked at her over it with those dark eyes that still, after 9 years of knowing him, caught her in that same arrested way. "Good," he said, and set his cup down and rose from the table and came around to where she sat and kissed her on the top of her head and then on her temple and then more deliberately on her mouth, and she laughed into it. "You are an absolute constant," she said. "I try to be," he said. Their daughter arrived in October of 1887, exactly when Cora had calculated she would, because Cora was extremely precise about such things. She was small and loud, and decided from the first moment that she was the center of everything, which she was, and they named her June, after the month of the year that Cora privately felt was the best one in Nevada, when the wildflowers were finished blooming but the heat had not yet become serious. Samuel received his sister with the same seriousness he brought to everything, inspected her carefully, and declared her acceptable. Eli, 4 years old and deeply interested in drama, cried for 20 minutes from sheer emotion, and then recovered completely and tried to give her a piece of dried apple, which Martha Hale, who was still present and involved in their lives with the consistent warmth she brought to everything, gently redirected. June Bishop grew into a small, fierce, laughing creature with her mother's directness and her father's capacity for stillness, which she deployed selectively and dramatically, and usually to great effect. She followed Cora around the store on the days when the boys were in school and there was no one to leave her with, and watched her work with the concentrated attention of someone storing information for later use. The years settled into their shape. Gerald Fitch, retired and living with his daughter in Carson City, visited twice a year, and always left saying that Dust Creek had turned out better than he had hoped. Anna Reyes, Cora's apprentice, opened her own small sewing shop in 1889 and sent Cora a letter that was more eloquent than she probably knew, and Cora kept it in the drawer of her counter for years. Clement spoke at town meetings after that first time occasionally, not often. But when he had something to say that needed saying, he said it, and people listened in the particular way they listen to someone who does not speak carelessly. His reputation for plain honesty was its own kind of authority, earned without seeking it, and he wore it the same way he wore everything, without display. In 1891, Samuel Bishop was 12 years old and already taller than most adults, and spent his free hours on the ranch with a seriousness of purpose that made both his parents watch him with the particular pleasure of recognizing someone becoming themselves. Eli was 7 and boundlessly energetic, and had recently developed a passion for drawing that covered every available flat surface in the house with horses and cows and improbable western landscapes. June was 4 and entirely in charge of everything she encountered. One October evening, when the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet with the particular quality of autumn stillness, Cora and Clement sat on the porch in 2 chairs they had brought outside, wrapped in separate blankets, watching the stars come out over the desert. The air smelled of dry grass and cool earth and the distant smoke from someone's fire. "I've been thinking about something," Cora said. "I know," he said. "I've had your thinking expression since dinner." "I have a thinking expression. You go very still," he said. "Quieter than usual. It's different from your regular quiet." She considered this. "You noticed that," she said. "I notice most things about you," he said, without particular emphasis, the way you state a fact. She looked at the stars. "I want to expand the tailoring side of the business," she said. "Take on another apprentice and do more custom work. Less dry goods, more tailored garments. The demand is there. The territory is growing." "Then do it," he said. "It would mean rearranging the store," she said. "Less floor space for the general goods." "General goods have Pete and young aldermen to manage them," he said. "You shouldn't be doing work you don't need to do when you have work that you're better at." She looked at him sidelong. "You're very clear about what I should do." "I'm clear about what you're capable of," he said. "It's different. You always have been. I've been watching you for 13 years. She felt the warmth of this move through her, the long, patient warmth of being truly known by someone who chose to keep knowing you. 13 years, she said. "That's a long time to watch someone." "I'm patient," he said simply. She laughed, and the laugh was genuine and warm and floated out into the desert evening, and he turned his head toward it with the expression that was still, after all the years, the one she loved best, the one that said she was worth every moment of his attention. "Clement," she said, "I think this is the best life I could have built," she said. "I want you to know that." He was quiet for a moment in the good way. "I think it's the best life I could have lived," he said. "I also want you to know that." They sat together in the October night, the desert spread around them vast and dark and full of stars, the ranch quiet behind them, the children sleeping inside, the town 3 miles west with its lights and its life and its imperfect, growing, ordinary community. Everything was where it was supposed to be. Everything was what they had made it. In the years that followed, Cora Bishop's tailoring shop would become the finest in the county, known throughout Nevada for the quality of its work and the exactness of its execution. Samuel Bishop would take over his father's ranch at 22, adding to it and expanding it, and doing it with the same steady capability that had always characterized his father's work. Eli Bishop, to no one who knew him's great surprise, became an artist of some regional reputation, painting the western landscapes he had been drawing since he was 7 with a precision and vividness that were equal and essential to each other. June Bishop, fierce and laughing and entirely herself, would grow up to study law in San Francisco and come back to Nevada with opinions about women's suffrage that she expressed publicly and without apology. Clement continued to be exactly himself, which was, Cora had always thought, the greatest gift he could give anyone. He was there and he was honest and he was quiet when quiet was right and he spoke when speaking was necessary. He grew older in the way that a man who has worked with his body his whole life grows older, more slowly and more solidly than the years might suggest, and his dark eyes remained as attentive as they had ever been. On the morning of their 20th anniversary, in December of 1898, he brought her coffee in bed, which was not a thing he did often because she was usually awake before him. But today he had gotten up first, quietly, and she had half-woken and watched him through her eyelashes and then genuinely slept again. And when she opened her eyes for real, the room was light and the coffee was on the table beside her and he was sitting in the chair by the window. 20 years, she said. 20 years, he said. She sat up and wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. Outside, the morning light on the Nevada desert was the particular clear gold of December, and the ranch was quiet, and the distant hills were blue-purple against the sky. No regrets, he asked, in the direct way he had, because he was always interested in the actual answer. She looked at him, this man she had been building a life beside for 20 years, who had stood up in a room full of people because something needed saying and no one else was going to say it, who had handed her coffee and a borrowed horse, and a ring with a turquoise stone, and the most honest courtship she had ever heard of, who had given her 3 children and a partnership so genuine it was almost its own kind of freedom, who had watched her with those patient dark eyes for 2 decades and was still watching. None, she said, with the settled, whole certainty of someone who means it absolutely. Not a single one. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, completely, without reservation. Good, he said softly. She smiled. He smiled. Outside, the desert morning spread itself wide and golden and full of the clear winter light they both loved, and the life they had built together went on around them, solid and warm and entirely their own.